Every system begins with a promise, not a written promise, not a law passed by Parliament, but a shared belief, the belief that money represents real value, that debt will eventually be repaid, that growth is real, measurable, and sufficient, and that if you work within the system long enough, it will eventually work for you. For most people alive today, that belief has never truly been questioned. You grow up, you study, you work, you earn, you save. Governments borrow, companies invest, banks intermediate. The system feels complicated, but orderly. Risk exists, but it feels contained. Crises happen, but they are framed as accidents, shocks, black swans, temporary breakdowns in an otherwise functional machine. But what if the machine is working exactly as intended? What if the global financial system was never designed to be stable, balanced, or paid back? What if instability is not a bug, but the fuel? To understand that, you have to stop looking at debt as a number and start looking at it as a structure. Debt is not just money owed. Debt is a claim on future production. When a government borrows, it is not borrowing existing wealth. It is borrowing from the future. When a corporation issues bonds, it is promising profits that do not yet exist. When households take loans, they are committing years, sometimes decades of future labor. Individually, this logic makes sense. Collectively, it creates a paradox. Because if everyone is borrowing from the future at the same time, who is the lender? At the global level, there is no external creditor. There is no higher balance sheet. There is no outside entity waiting patiently to be repaid. The world cannot borrow from somewhere else. It can only borrow from itself, which means global debt is not something that can ever be paid off in aggregate. It can only be rolled forward, restructured, inflated away, or defaulted on. This is not ideology. It is arithmetic. As of today, global debt exceeds $300 trillion. Global GDP is roughly $100 trillion. That means the world owes about $3 for every dollar it produces in a year. Even if every cent of global output went toward debt repayment, which is impossible, it would take years just to stand still, and that assumes no new debt is created during that time. But new debt is always created. In fact, the system requires it. Since 2000, global debt has grown more than 3 times faster than global economic output. After the 2008 financial crisis, governments did not reduce leverage. They increased it. US federal debt was under $10 trillion in 2008. Today it exceeds $34 trillion. Japan's government debt surpassed 260% of GDP. Europe followed a similar path. Corporate debt exploded. Household debt never meaningfully deleveraged. Every crisis was solved the same way, by adding more debt. This is where the promise comes in. The promise that growth will catch up, that productivity will rise, that innovation will save the math, that tomorrow's economy will be large enough to service yesterday's promises. Sometimes that works for a while. After World War II, debt levels were high, but growth was higher. The US economy expanded rapidly. Population grew. Industrial capacity surged. Debt shrank relative to output. The promise looked real. The system looked honest. But that period was the exception, not the rule. Since the 1970s, something fundamental changed. Economic growth slowed, but debt accelerated. Productivity gains diminished. Real wages stagnated. In the United States, productivity has increased more than 3 times since 1971, but real median wages barely moved. The difference did not disappear. It went somewhere else. It went into asset prices. Stocks, real estate, bonds, financial assets, these absorbed the excess claims created by debt. The system stopped distributing growth broadly and started concentrating it narrowly. Debt no longer funded productive expansion. It funded price inflation. And the system adapted. Instead of promising prosperity, it promised stability. Instead of saying debt will be paid back, it quietly shifted to saying it will be managed, refinanced, extended, rolled over, perpetually. This is when debt stopped being a temporary tool and became a permanent feature. Government stopped talking about repayment, and started talking about sustainability. Central banks stopped worrying about bubbles and started worrying about financial conditions. Interest rates trended toward zero not because the economy was healthy, but because it could not survive higher rates. By the 2010s, the math had become unavoidable. Even modest interest rate increases threatened to destabilize the entire system. That is why rates stayed near zero for more than a decade, not as stimulus, as life support. When rates finally rose in 2022, the consequences were immediate. Banks failed. Bond portfolios collapsed. Governments faced exploding interest costs. The system revealed a truth it had been hiding for years. It only works when money is cheap and debt is growing. Which brings us back to the central question. If everyone owes money, who is the lender? On paper, governments owe bondholders. Corporations owe investors. Households owe banks. But follow the chain far enough and it loops back on itself. Pension funds hold government bonds. Banks hold sovereign debt. Central banks backstop banks. Governments backstop central banks. The liabilities circulate within the same closed system. There is no final creditor, which means the system depends entirely on confidence. Confidence that promises will be honored. Confidence that money will retain value. Confidence that future growth will be sufficient to justify present debt. And confidence is not enforced by math. It is enforced by belief. As long as people believe the promise, the system holds. As soon as they do not, it does not gradually weaken. It snaps. History has shown this pattern repeatedly. Debt grows faster than output. Claims exceed reality. The system adapts by redefining terms. Repayment becomes management. Stability replaces solvency. And the promise becomes more abstract, less measurable, more psychological. This is the stage the world is in now. Not collapse, not recovery, but something more fragile. A system that cannot be paid back, but must be believed in. And once belief becomes a primary asset, everything else becomes secondary. Because the moment that belief cracks, the question everyone avoided becomes unavoidable. If the debt can't be paid, what happens next? When belief begins to weaken, the system does not collapse immediately. It adapts. It changes language, incentives, and rules to keep the illusion intact. This is where monetary policy stops being about economics and starts being about psychology. Central banks are often described as lenders of last resort. In reality, they are belief managers. Their true job is not to control inflation or maximize employment, but to maintain confidence in a system that cannot mathematically resolve itself. Consider interest rates. In a healthy system, interest is the price of money. It reflects risk, scarcity, and time. But in a debt-saturated system, interest becomes a threat. Every percentage point increase multiplies obligations across governments, corporations, and households simultaneously. In the United States, each 1% increase in average interest rates adds hundreds of billions of dollars in annual debt, servicing costs to the federal budget. By 2024, interest expense alone exceeded the defense budget, surpassing $900 billion per year. That number grows automatically without new programs, without new wars, without new legislation. It grows because the system is leveraged to the past. This is why rates stayed near zero for so long. Not because inflation was gone, but because the system could not tolerate normalization. Zero rates were not a stimulus. They were a confession. And when zero was not enough, central banks crossed a line that had never been crossed at this scale. They started printing money to buy debt. Quantitative easing is often explained as a temporary emergency tool. But look at the numbers. After 2008, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from under $900 billion to over $4.5 trillion. After 2020, it surged again, peaking near $9 trillion. The European Central Bank followed a similar path. The Bank of Japan went even further, owning a majority of its own government bond market. This was not liquidity support. It was structural monetization. Central banks became the buyers of last resort because no one else could absorb the volume of debt at acceptable rates. Pension funds, insurers, and foreign governments all had limits. Only central banks could buy infinite quantities without demanding higher returns. And when central banks buy government debt with newly created money, the distinction between fiscal and monetary policy disappears. Governments spend, central banks fund. The loop closes. This is where debt stops being a contract and becomes a political instrument. The promise shifts again, not that debt will be repaid, but that inflation will remain manageable. Not that money will hold value, but that it will lose value slowly enough to avoid panic. Inflation, in this context, is not an accident. It is a release valve. When debt becomes too large to service honestly, it must be reduced dishonestly, through currency debasement, through negative real interest rates, through silent transfers from savers to debtors. From the 1970s onward, this pattern repeated. In the US, average inflation-adjusted returns on savings accounts were negative for decades. Government bonds often yielded less than inflation. Holding cash became a guaranteed loss over time. This was not incompetence. It was necessity. Because if inflation did not do the work, defaults would. And defaults are politically unacceptable. So instead of saying, we can't pay what we owe, the system says, your money is worth a little less than you remember. Gradually, quietly, year after year. Most people do not notice. Until they do. Housing is a perfect example. In 1980, the median US home costs about 3 times the median household income. Today, in many regions, it exceeds 6 or 7 times income. That is not because homes became twice as valuable. It is because currency lost purchasing power faster than wages rose. The same is true for education, healthcare, and assets generally. Prices inflate where money flows, and money flows toward collateral. Debt-backed money always seeks security, which brings us to the second pillar of belief, assets. In a system overloaded with debt, assets are no longer just investments. They are protection. They are the places where excess currency hides to avoid dilution. This is why asset prices rise even when economic fundamentals weaken. It is not optimism, it is defense. This is also why inequality widens. Those who own assets benefit from inflation. Those who rely on wages do not. Debt inflates asset prices first. Wages last of it all. The system does not reward productivity. It rewards position. And over time, this creates a dangerous imbalance. Because belief cannot be maintained indefinitely if lived reality contradicts the narrative. When people are told inflation is temporary, but rents double. When they are told growth is strong, but living standards fall. When they are told debt is manageable, but taxes rise and services decline. At that point, belief does not fade evenly. It fractures. Some people double down. They speculate. They chase returns. They leverage. Others withdraw. They hoard. They disengage. They lose trust. This is when systems enter the instability phase. Not collapse yet. Instability. Historically, this is a phase where policy becomes reactive, inconsistent, and increasingly aggressive. Controls appear. Capital restrictions. Financial repression. Regulatory changes framed as protection. In the 1970s, the US responded to inflation with price controls. In emerging markets, governments have responded with capital controls and forced conversions. In Europe, bail-ins replaced bailouts. Different tools, same logic. Protect the system by limiting choice. Because once people are free to exit en masse, the game ends. This is why modern systems prioritize confidence above all else. Markets can fall. Growth can stall. But confidence must not break, which leads to the final mechanism the system relies on, narrative. Debt is no longer framed as a risk. It is framed as normal, as modern, as necessary. Anyone questioning it is labeled alarmist, outdated, uninformed. But narratives cannot override arithmetic forever. At some point, the system must reconcile claims with reality, either through growth, which is no longer sufficient, or through restructuring, which is politically dangerous. There is a third path, historically speaking, one that does not look like collapse at first. A reset, not an event announced on the news, not a single moment, but a sequence. Currency adjustments, new frameworks, new rules, new definitions of money, savings, and ownership. Resets do not feel like endings when they begin. They feel like reforms. And by the time people realize what changed, the old system is already gone. That is where the world is now. Not on the edge of chaos, but in the quiet phase before the rules change. And the only question that matters is not whether change is coming. It is who will be positioned on the right side of it when it arrives. When resets happen, they are never presented as failures. They are framed as upgrades, modernization, necessary evolution. The language is always reassuring, technical, and forward-looking. But the substance is always the same. Existing claims are reduced, rearranged, or erased to restore balance between promises and reality. History gives us a clear template. In 1933, the United States confiscated gold and devalued the dollar by nearly 40%. Officially, it was to stabilize the economy. In reality, it reduced the real value of government debt overnight. Bondholders lost purchasing power. The system survived. In 1971, the gold window was closed. The dollar was no longer redeemable for gold. Again, this was framed as temporary. It was not. The result was a massive expansion of credit over the next 5 decades. Debt soared, assets inflated, wages lagged. The system survived again. Each reset preserved the structure by sacrificing the rules. And each time, those closest to the system adjusted first. This is the critical insight most people miss. Resets do not affect everyone equally. They never have. They redistribute silently, unevenly, and legally, not through collapse, but through redesign. Look at inflation-adjusted wealth transfers. Since 2020 alone, US M2 money supply expanded by over 40% at its peak. During that same period, asset prices surged. The S&P 500 doubled from its 2020 lows before correcting. Housing prices rose over 45% nationally. Meanwhile, real wages fell when adjusted for inflation. This was not random. It was directional. Those holding assets early benefited. Those holding cash paid the price. This is how modern resets operate. They do not take wealth directly. They change the unit of measurement. And now, the system is approaching the limits of even this approach. Debt levels are so high that inflation is strong enough to meaningfully reduce them risks destabilizing society. But inflation low enough to preserve social order makes debt mathematically unserviceable. That is the trap. So the system begins searching for new mechanisms. Digital currencies, new reserve frameworks, expanded central bank powers, financial surveillance framed as stability, restrictions framed as protection. None of this requires malicious intent. Systems do not need villains. They follow incentives. And the incentive is survival. Consider central bank digital currencies. Officially, they are about efficiency, speed, inclusion. But structurally, they solve a deeper problem. They allow direct control over money at the individual level. Negative rates become enforceable. Capital flight becomes preventable. Stimulus becomes targeted and conditional. From a system perspective, this is rational. From a trust perspective, it is dangerous. Because trust once lost cannot be printed. The irony is that the more tightly the system tries to control outcomes, the more fragile belief becomes. Confidence is strongest when people feel choice, weakest when they feel trapped. History shows this clearly. Capital controls accelerate collapse, they do not prevent it. Currency reforms without trust fail. Monetary resets without legitimacy create black markets, parallel systems, and eventually breakdowns. Which brings us back to the individual level. What does all of this mean for someone inside the system but not controlling it? It means the old rules no longer apply. Saving currency is no longer neutral. It is a position. and historically, it has been the weakest one during resets. Holding long-duration promises in an environment of structural instability is not conservative. It is exposed. This does not mean panic. It does not mean abandoning society. It means understanding incentives. Systems protect themselves first. They protect large institutions, then critical markets, then social stability. Individuals are last. Always have been. This is why sophisticated actors diversify across systems, not just within them. They hold assets that are not easily diluted. They minimize dependence on promises that require uninterrupted trust. They stay flexible. They do not predict dates. They prepare for patterns. And the pattern is clear. Debt has outgrown growth. Monetary tools are losing effectiveness. Confidence is being maintained through increasingly complex interventions. And history tells us that complexity is the final stage before simplification. Resets simplify. They wipe clean what cannot be reconciled. This does not mean the world ends. It means the scoreboard resets. Some balances are rewritten. Some claims disappear. Some structures change names but retain function. And life goes on just with different rules. The danger is not collapse. The danger is assuming continuity. Every generation that experienced a monetary reset believed theirs would be different, smarter, more advanced, better managed, and every time, the outcome followed the same logic. Paper promises expand until belief can no longer support them. Then reality intervenes. The uncomfortable truth is that no financial system based on perpetual debt has ever resolved peacefully without devaluation, restructuring, or default. Not Rome, not Spain, not Britain, not Weimar, not Argentina, not post-war America. The tools change. The outcome does not. Which brings us to the final point. This series is not about fear. It is about clarity. If you understand that the system is designed to roll forward, not settle, to manage belief, not resolve debt, to preserve itself, not guarantee fairness, then your expectations change. You stop asking when it will be fixed. You start asking how it will adjust. And more importantly, where you are positioned when it does. Because the people who suffer most in resets are not the reckless. They are the compliant. The ones who assumed the rules were permanent. The ones who trusted continuity in a system built on change. History does not punish ignorance. It punishes misplaced trust. And that is why understanding the structure matters more than predicting the outcome. The debt cannot be paid. The system knows it. The question is not whether a reset comes. It is whether you recognize it while it is happening.